Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I want to start off by saying very clearly that just a few years ago, up until the year 2005, I myself used to believe that Muhammad was a prophet of Allah. I used to believe that the Quran was his final revelation, the whole compilation of everything that had come before, brought to its summit in the form of God's book revealed to Muhammad over 23 years. I used to believe that Muhammad was the exemplary man, and that following his every action, his every word, his every utterance would produce in me a character that would be beyond all characters. And I used to believe that Jesus was just a prophet, yes, the Messiah, even going to come back to initiate the end of times, but not God, by any means, certainly not God. These were the things I used to believe. And I found out over time that in order to really be able to believe truly in my heart what I think is the truth, I need to be able to defend it for myself. I need to not just take what people tell me, but rather investigate, understand what is the grounding of these facts, these beliefs in truth. Are they honestly true? Or am I just taking them at face value because people I've respected my whole life have told me they're true? And that was the case. My parents told me to believe in Islam. The imams had told me to believe in Islam. I had so many people who I respected telling me what to believe, and so I listened to them. And at a certain point I realized I need to look into these things for myself. And I had been challenged to do so as well. But I was so convinced that Islam is true that I knew right off the bat, no matter what historical investigation I undertook, it would lead me to confirm the things that I had been taught about Muhammad, about Jesus, about the Quran, about everything that Islam taught me. And I figured just looking into these things will confirm what I already believe. Today we're going to be talking specifically about Jesus. And Jesus was actually the turning point. When I investigated the life of Jesus as told by the Quran versus the Christian theology, and I compared it to history, that was the turning point in my understanding of the truth. First of all, I just knew, when I started this investigation, I knew that the Quran would be confirmed by history. I knew that according to the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَّبُوهُ, He was not killed, Jesus Christ was not killed, nor was He crucified. وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ, but so it appeared to them. So this is saying in the Quran, Jesus was not killed on the cross, nor was He crucified, but so it was made to appear to them. The Quran makes it very clear Jesus did not die on the cross. And so as a Muslim, I had thought surely an investigation of history would confirm this. The Quran also said that Jesus certainly wasn't God. Chapter 5, verse 116 and 117. And behold, God will say, talking about in the future, at the end of times, God will say, O Jesus, the Son of Mary, did you say to men, worship me, as in worship Jesus, and my mother, as gods, in addition to Allah? He will say, glory be to you. Never could I say what I had no right to say. Never did I say to them anything except what you told me to say. Worship God, my Lord and your Lord. So the Quran makes it clear, Jesus never claimed to be God. He never told anyone to worship Him. This is something that must have happened later because while He was with them, they didn't say anything of the sort. And I knew, again, as a Muslim when I was investigating history, that this would probably be confirmed. Finally, the third thing that the Quran told me, but with which Christians were in general agreement, was that Jesus did miracles. The Quran chapter 3 verse 49 says, I have come to you with a sign from your Lord, in that I make for you out of clay, as it were, the figure of a bird, and breathe into it, and it becomes a living bird by God's leave. And I heal those that are born blind, and the lepers, and I bring the dead to life by God's leave. So here in this statement, chapter 3 of the Quran, verse 49, Jesus is giving life to birds. He's cleansing the lepers. He's giving sight to the blind. He's even raising the dead. Jesus is clearly miraculous in the Quran. And I figured an historical investigation would confirm this as well. And knowing these things, I had the Christian belief, on the other hand, to which I was going to compare my historical investigation. For one, Christianity taught that Jesus died on the cross. All four Gospels, and Q, if you believe in Q theory, all five sources clearly say that Jesus died on the cross. There's no equivocation in this matter. They make it extremely clear Jesus died on the cross. They also extremely clearly state that Jesus claimed to be God, that Jesus received worship, that He was in fact entitled to all things God was entitled to. The Gospels make this extremely clear. So the question for me was simple. How do I find out what's the truth? We have these two conflicting worldviews. How do I find out what's the truth? The answer is simple. When you're investigating something from a historical perspective, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to go to books written hundreds and hundreds of years later to see what a man was like? Absolutely not. You go to the books that are written right around that person's life. For example, if I want to read about Abraham Lincoln, I could read books about him now, or I could read the primary sources that were written right around his life. Which one of those two is more likely to be accurate? The one written right by his lifetime. It's not leaving out any details that we might have wanted to add over time. So when we turn to the life of Jesus, what do I want to study? Books written hundreds of years later, hundreds of miles later in different social contexts? Or do we want to read the books that are written first and foremost about him, the very first ones, and what they say? Well, I did some brief historical investigation. I found out that the books that were written most close to Jesus' life about him are in fact the four Gospels of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four of them were written no later than 70 years after Jesus' death. In fact, parts of the Gospel of Mark are thought to have been written within a decade after Jesus' death. The entire Gospel of Mark, no more than 30 years after Jesus' death. Some people would extend that to 70 years. To 40 years. But even 40 years. This is still the earliest book that we have. When it comes to great historical figures like Alexander the Great, the first books that we have are more than 3 centuries after his death. And so when we compare the life of Jesus to the Gospels that we have and the amount of time that transpired between them, it really is minimal. And we can thus trust the New Testament to at least be historically accurate to a high degree. Now, if there are things that conflict in the New Testament, remember, I'm thinking as a Muslim still at this point. If there are things that conflict in the Gospels of the New Testament, then we can throw certain sections out. We can say, okay, these conflict, we'll leave it out. This does not conflict, we should assume it's true. But if there are some things that are said over and over and over again in all the Gospels and never contradicted, then those are most likely to be accurate. This was the mindset with which I started my investigation of Jesus Christ. The very first issue I decided to investigate was one that seemed less emotionally charged. Did Jesus die on the cross or not? Is this something that happened in history? Well, of course. He either died or he didn't. This isn't a matter of philosophy, so we can investigate it. As it turned out, when I was looking at the sources and what they said, without exception, all the sources around Jesus' life make it abundantly clear that Jesus did die on the cross. Jewish sources such as Josephus, Mara bar Serapion, and Talmud, people who are writing about Jesus from a Jewish perspective, they all agree Jesus died on the cross. Gentile sources such as Tacitus and Lucian of Samosata, they agree that Jesus died on the cross. First-generation Christians such as such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, the author of the book of Hebrews, all of them agree that Jesus died on the cross. And second-generation Christians, such as Papias, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, all of them agree that Jesus died on the cross. All these people wrote down the fact that Jesus died on the cross, and there was no one who even ventured to write any conception of the idea that he did not die on the cross. There's nothing to the contrary. If you want to go even earlier than that, we can. New Testament scholars have determined that there are certain creeds within the New Testament that are traced back to even before the authors who recorded them. Yes, they were recorded by certain authors, but they were written before that. For example, in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, the Carmen Christi. This is known to be a hymn that early Christians sang to Jesus, and that Paul simply recorded. He did not invent. What does this say? This says that he died on the cross as well. Other creeds also, 1 Corinthians 15 says the same thing. In fact, 1 Corinthians 15 has been investigated by atheists and agnostics ad nauseum. I mean, they have really studied this thing. And one atheist who's very much against Christianity, his name is Marcus Borg, he has said that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that says Jesus died on the cross was made within months of Jesus' death. You can have nothing faster in history. You can have nothing closer to the event. Jesus killed in early part of the year, and by the end of the year, people are already writing down the fact that he died on the cross. There is nothing that we can have that's stronger. This is why scholars today say the death of Jesus Christ on the cross is among the most incontrovertible facts of history. Gert Ludemann, an atheist New Testament scholar, says Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan, again, no friend of Christianity, but a well-known scholar, says there's not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Crossan also said that he was crucified is as sure as anything can ever be. Paula Fredrickson, another scholar, says the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover. Finally, no